I had just put my hand on the doorknob when I heard shattered sobbing coming from the living room. Not ordinary crying, but a sound strangled, like someone trying not to scream while being broken from the inside. I pushed the door open and saw my wife curled up on the sofa, both arms wrapped tightly around her chest as if holding something that was about to fall apart. My daughter stood a few steps away, holding a stack of papers, her face pale but her lips curved into a smile. She turned to me and said a sentence that made my blood run cold. "You came back at just the right time. Mom just agreed to sign." I froze in the doorway, the leather briefcase slipping from my hand and hitting the floor with a dull thud. In that moment, all the sounds around me seemed to disappear, leaving only the pounding of my heart so loud my ears rang. I was used to long workdays, used to the exhaustion of a 67-year-old man still trying to keep a steady routine. But I had never prepared myself for a scene like this inside my own home. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. Margaret didn't look up at me. Her shoulders trembled slightly, each breath broken, like someone who had just escaped a nightmare. The silver hair she usually kept neatly tied back now hung loose and messy, a few strands clinging to her pale cheek. I hurried over, knelt in front of the sofa, and placed my hand on her knee. Her skin was unusually cold. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice hoarse despite my effort to stay calm. Margaret opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips quivered, her lower jaw lightly tapping against the upper, as if she were trying to hold something back. She shook her head very slightly, her eyes avoiding mine, not daring to look at me directly. In 39 years of marriage, I had seen Margaret sick, had seen her cry at her parents' funerals, had seen her force a smile when we lost a large portion of our savings during the financial crisis years ago. But I had never seen her like this, panicked, silent, as if every word had been stripped away. I turned my head and looked at Lauren. She stood there, back straight, shoulders slightly tensed. The stack of papers in her hands was clipped neatly together, the edges still new, white enough to glare under the living room lights. Lauren wasn't crying. She didn't look shaken. On the contrary, she was calm in a way that felt unsettling, even wearing a thin smile, the kind I used to see on her face as a child whenever she'd done something wrong, but believed she had arranged things well enough to get away with it. "Don't worry, Dad," she went on, her voice even, like she was reading from a report. "Mom's just a little tired. I talked to her for a bit. Everything's done." "Everything?" I asked, forcing my voice not to tremble. Lauren shrugged slightly. "Just some paperwork. Financial stuff. For the future. You know, you and Mom aren't young anymore." The words themselves sounded reasonable, but the way she said them, cold and clipped, sent a chill down my spine. I bent down and took Margaret's hand. That was when I noticed her sweater sleeve was pulled lower than usual, covering her wrist. But when she shifted unconsciously, the cuff slid back, revealing a dark patch of skin. A bruise. Not the faint kind from a light bump. It was deep, clear, like the mark of someone's fingers gripping hard in anger. My heart tightened. I reached out to pull her sleeve up a little more, but Margaret flinched, quickly pulling her hand back and pressing it against her chest. "It's nothing," Lauren spoke up immediately, so fast it was almost as if she'd rehearsed it. "Mom bumped into the edge of the table in the kitchen. She's clumsy, Dad. She's been like that lately." Margaret lowered her head further, as if that explanation were a verdict. She didn't argue. She didn't confirm it either. She just sat there, shrinking into herself, smaller than the familiar sofa beneath her. The room suddenly felt suffocating. The air thickened, making it hard to breathe. The warm yellow light Margaret always loved now looked cold. The family photos on the wall, me, Margaret, and Lauren across different years, suddenly felt foreign, like they belonged to some family I used to know, not the one standing in front of me now. I stood up slowly. I didn't say anything else. Not because I believed Lauren, but because something deep inside me warned that if I confronted her right then, everything would collapse in a far worse way. I had been an engineer my whole life, used to observing before acting, used to reading the smallest signs before making a decision. And right now, every tiny detail was screaming that something was terribly wrong. "Go upstairs and rest," I said to Margaret, my voice so gentle it surprised even me. "I'll make you some tea." Margaret nodded faintly, like a machine. Lauren quickly stepped forward to support her mother, an action that looked caring on the surface but made my skin crawl. She was too quick, too precise, as if she were replaying a role she had already practiced. When the two of them disappeared down the hallway toward the bedroom, I was left alone in the living room. I looked down at the floor where my briefcase still lay. I bent down to pick it up, my hand shaking slightly. Inside me, a feeling both familiar and strange was taking shape, the feeling of suspicion. I had suspected business partners before. I had doubted numbers on blueprints, questioned overly smooth promises from contractors. But suspecting my own daughter? That was something I had never once considered in nearly 40 years of being a father. That evening, dinner passed in silence. Lauren talked a lot, filling the space with small talk about work and future plans, as if trying to patch over the emptiness with words. Margaret ate very little. She held her spoon without lifting it to her mouth, her gaze distant, occasionally flicking toward Lauren before dropping back down. I watched everything, missing no detail. The way Margaret startled whenever Lauren stood up. The way Lauren rested her hand on her mother's shoulder a little longer than necessary. The way she answered for Margaret whenever I asked even the simplest question. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I stayed behind in the living room alone. The house was so quiet, I could hear the wall clock ticking, each beat steady and clear. I looked around the home I had lived in for over 30 years, the place where I had fixed every hinge, replaced every tile, the place I had believed was an absolute safe haven for my family. For the first time, it no longer felt safe. The image of the bruise on Margaret's wrist kept replaying in my mind, vivid and sharp. And along with it, Lauren's words, "Mom just agreed to sign." Sign what? Under what circumstances? And why had Margaret been so terrified? I knew that from that moment on, a line had been crossed. I didn't yet know exactly what it was or who would pay the price, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not let this truth pass in silence. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when I stood up, turned off the lights, and headed toward the staircase leading to our bedroom, the first real question had already formed in my mind, a question I could not and would not ignore. After that night, lying beside Margaret in our familiar bedroom, I couldn't sleep. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, as if each breath took effort. I lay on my side, staring at the dim ceiling, and my memories began to rewind, slowly but relentlessly, carrying me back to the time Lauren returned to this house, not as a daughter coming home, but gradually, like a guest who stayed so long she forgot she was only a guest. Lauren came back nearly 2 years ago after her second divorce. I remember that day clearly. It was late autumn, the wind scattering red maple leaves across the front porch. She stood at the door with 2 large suitcases, eyes red from crying, yet her back still straight. She hugged Margaret for a long time, sobbing into her mother's shoulder like a child. I stood behind them, placed a hand on her back, feeling the familiar trembling of someone who had just lost her support. "I'll only stay for a while," Lauren said as she stepped inside. "Just until I get things sorted out." We didn't ask many questions. What parents would turn away their child in that situation? Margaret prepared Lauren's old bedroom, changed the sheets, placed a small vase of flowers on the table by the window. I fixed the lock, checked the heating system, doing the familiar tasks of a father who believed everything would eventually be fine. In the first few months, Lauren truly seemed like a devoted daughter. She woke up earlier than her mother, made coffee, prepared breakfast. She drove Margaret to her regular checkups, carefully writing down every instruction from the doctor. She spoke gently and patiently, often reminding me that Mom needed more rest and shouldn't worry so much. I looked at her then and thought maybe life had hardened her, but hadn't taken away the best part of her. Lauren also took over chores Margaret had always done. She did the laundry, cleaned, reorganized the kitchen. At first, Margaret laughed and said her daughter was doing too much. Lauren just smiled back. "Let me handle it. You've worked hard your whole life." I believed that. I wanted to believe it. Then things began to change. Not suddenly, but gradually, like water seeping into wood. Lauren started asking more detailed questions about our daily routines. What time Margaret took her medication, which ones, what dosage. She suggested gathering all the pills together, sorting them by day and time, saying it would be safer. Then came the finances. Lauren didn't ask directly. She began with very reasonable questions. "Do you and Mom remember how many accounts you have? Are you sure those investments are still doing okay? There are so many scams targeting older people these days." She spoke with what sounded like genuine concern, or at least looked like it. I didn't object. I had always managed things myself, but I didn't see anything wrong with my daughter taking an interest. I showed her a few documents, thinking it would just put her at ease. Margaret was different. I started noticing she smiled less. She no longer made small decisions on her own the way she used to. Whenever Lauren spoke, Margaret would often fall silent, nod, or glance at me as if waiting for a reaction. Some evenings, she startled just because Lauren accidentally dropped a spoon in the kitchen. Small things, but repeated too many times to be coincidence. I explained it all away with a reason that felt very familiar: old age. I told myself Margaret was in her 60s, her memory not as sharp, her nerves more fragile. I told myself Lauren was simply doing what was necessary, that she was stronger, more decisive, and therefore naturally more dominant. There were times I saw Lauren step into decisions that had always belonged to Margaret and me, like fixing the roof. I had called a familiar contractor and set a date for an inspection. Lauren overheard and said it wasn't urgent, that we should wait for more quotes, that Dad was no longer up to date with market prices. I felt irritated but said nothing. I thought it was better to give in a little to keep the peace. Then it extended into more personal matters. Lauren said Margaret shouldn't drive anymore, that her reflexes were slowing. She took the car keys, saying it was temporary. Margaret didn't argue. She just sat by the window every morning, looking out at the old car parked quietly in the driveway. I began to notice that conversations in the house no longer happened in front of me. Lauren and Margaret spoke privately in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in hushed voices. When I walked in, they stopped. Lauren smiled and changed the subject. Margaret lowered her head, hands clasped together. Once I asked Margaret about a medical appointment I clearly remembered had been scheduled. She looked at me blankly, then turned to Lauren. My daughter answered for her. I rescheduled it. The doctor said it wasn't urgent. I stood there, feeling like an outsider in my own family. The feeling was strange and unsettling, but I still couldn't name it. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that maybe I just wasn't used to my grown daughter having her own voice. Until I realized something simple and frightening. I was no longer the first person being asked. Decisions, even small ones, seemed to go through Lauren first. Margaret asked her daughter what to eat, when to take medication, even who to call. The man who had lived with her for nearly 40 years, was slowly pushed to the edge of those conversations. The house was still mine on paper, but the sense of control was gone. I walked through the rooms, noticing familiar objects rearranged according to someone else's preferences. The filing cabinet in my office was sometimes opened, drawers subtly disturbed, enough for me to notice, not enough to accuse anyone outright. That night, lying in the dark, I heard Margaret turn over softly. I wanted to ask her everything, to pull her close and tell her I was still here, that she didn't need to be afraid. But I didn't, because I realized that somehow silence had crept in between us without either of us noticing. And in that silence, Lauren had stepped in, not loudly, not violently, but little by little, taking over the space, the time, and the decision-making power of this house. I closed my eyes, the feeling of losing control pressing heavily on my chest. For the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in the home I had spent half my life building. And I understood that if I stayed silent, I wouldn't just lose my voice. I might lose Margaret, in a way I hadn't yet dared to imagine, but had already begun to fear. In the days that followed, I began to observe Margaret more closely, not with the familiar eyes of a husband who knew every small habit of his wife, but with the guarded awareness of someone who felt something slipping beyond his reach. I noticed how she walked more slowly, not entirely because of age, but because of hesitation. There were moments when she stood in the middle of a room, as if weighing which direction to go, then glanced at Lauren before deciding. The bruise on her wrist the day I came home wasn't the first one. It was just the first time I had seen it clearly. In the days after, I noticed Margaret often wore long sleeves, even as the weather warmed. When she accidentally pulled her sleeve up to wash dishes or wipe the table, I saw other patches of discolored skin, some fading, some newer and darker. Each time I asked, the answer was the same, as if rehearsed. "I'm just clumsy." I didn't notice. I bumped into the door. And always, before Margaret could finish her sentence, Lauren appeared, quick, confident, like a wall blocking the rest of the explanation. "You know how Mom is," my daughter said, her tone lightly reproachful. "She's been forgetful and scattered lately. Don't stress her out more, Dad." Lauren never raised her voice. She was gentle, even caring, but every sentence carried an unspoken message. Margaret was no longer clear-headed enough to decide or explain things for herself. Once, when Margaret dropped a glass in the kitchen, Lauren rushed over, not to ask if her mother was hurt, but to quickly sweep up the shards, saying over and over, "See? I told you Mom shouldn't be doing these things alone anymore." Margaret stood there, hands trembling, head lowered, like a child being scolded for a small mistake. I stood at the kitchen doorway, feeling a slow burn of anger rise inside me, but I held it back. I still had no concrete proof, only a growing sense of unease. I told myself I couldn't rely on emotion alone. I needed to understand more. I began looking for moments to talk to Margaret alone, but those moments became rare. Lauren always seemed to be there at just the right time, as if she knew what I was about to do. When I invited Margaret into the garden to water the plants, Lauren followed, saying Mom shouldn't stay in the sun too long. When I suggested a walk around the neighborhood, Lauren offered to drive her instead for safety. One afternoon, when Lauren went out to run errands, I saw a rare opportunity. Margaret was sitting by the window, gazing at the line of maple trees in front of the house, sunlight highlighting the lines on her face. I pulled a chair closer and sat beside her. "Does your arm hurt?" I asked, as gently as I could. Margaret startled and turned to me. In her eyes, I saw a flicker of panic flash and disappear, like headlights in the night. She shook her head quickly, almost reflexively. "No, it's fine," she said. "Don't worry." I placed my hand over hers. Her hand was cold and tense, not relaxing at all despite my light grip. Margaret looked down at where our hands touched, then glanced toward the hallway where Lauren usually appeared. Is there something that's making you scared? I asked softly. Margaret didn't answer right away. She pressed her lips together, took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. When she looked at me again, the look in her eyes made my chest tighten. It wasn't the look of a frail woman. It wasn't confusion. It was the look of someone hiding something very big, very frightening. "There's nothing," she said, her voice lower. "Don't make things complicated." At that moment, the front door opened. Lauren was back. Margaret immediately pulled her hand away from mine, as if she had just touched something forbidden. I stood up and turned away, my heart heavy. From that day on, I began to memorize every detail, every small gesture. The way Lauren always positioned herself between me and Margaret when we talked. The way she answered for her mother, no matter who I addressed my question to. The way Margaret looked at Lauren before saying anything, as if asking for permission. Some of the things Lauren said sounded perfectly normal at first, even reasonable. But the more I heard them, the more uneasy I felt. Mom doesn't remember clearly anymore. She's easily influenced. "You know, Dad, Mom isn't like she used to be." Those phrases repeated over and over gradually formed a distorted picture of Margaret. A weak woman, no longer capable of making decisions for herself. And I realized that if this continued, not only I, but everyone around us would eventually start believing that picture. One evening, when Margaret went upstairs early because she was tired, Lauren stayed behind with me in the living room. She poured me a glass of water and set it in front of me, a gesture that looked thoughtful. "Dad," she said slowly, "don't you think you're a little too tense? Mom is weak now. Things would be easier if you let me handle it." I looked at my daughter for a long time. Under the light, her face was familiar down to every feature, but her eyes were different. They were no longer the eyes of the child who used to run home, proudly showing good grades, or the young woman who had sobbed uncontrollably when her first marriage fell apart. These eyes were colder, more calculating. "I can still manage things," I said. Lauren smiled, a smile that never reached her eyes. "You think so, but time waits for no one." That sentence echoed in my head long after she had gone upstairs. I sat alone, looking around the silent house. I remembered my younger years working on construction sites, where I learned to read warning signs before accidents happened. A beam making the wrong sound, a small crack in concrete. Back then, ignoring instinct came at a heavy cost. Now that instinct was returning, clear and unforgiving. It told me those bruises weren't accidents, that Margaret's silence wasn't random, that Lauren's words, wrapped in concern, were slowly stripping her mother of her voice, and mine as well. I began asking myself what I had missed and when. I blamed myself for accepting convenient explanations too easily. But at the same time, a quiet determination took shape. I would no longer allow myself to look away. I knew that from this moment on, I had to be more alert than ever. I had to remember every detail, every small contradiction, like pieces of a puzzle whose full image I had yet to see. And above all, I had to trust that old but loyal instinct, the one that had saved me from many mistakes in life and was now warning me that a very real danger was present inside this house. That night, after the brief conversation with Lauren in the living room, I didn't go up to the bedroom right away. I stayed alone, with only half the lights on, just enough to see the familiar outlines of the house. The wall clock ticked steadily, each beat reminding me that time was still moving, even though something in this house felt terrifyingly frozen. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overthinking. That age had made me more sensitive than usual. But the image of fear in Margaret's eyes, the hidden bruises, Lauren's repeated phrases, all of it refused to fade. They lined up in my mind, orderly and patient, as if waiting for me to do the very thing I had been avoiding. I stood up and slowly walked toward the small room at the end of the hallway, the one that housed the home security system. I had installed it a few years earlier after a string of petty thefts in the neighborhood. Back then, Margaret laughed and said I was being overly cautious. I laughed too, thinking maybe I really was just getting old and worrying too much. I never imagined that one day I would step into that room searching for the truth about my own family. The door closed behind me, creating a space cut off from the rest of the house. I turned on the monitor. A pale blue light washed over my face, cold and sterile. The familiar camera feeds appeared. Living room, kitchen, hallway, front door, back door. Everything looked still, harmless. I began rewinding the footage from that day. The morning passed normally. Margaret was in the kitchen making tea, Lauren sitting at the table talking on the phone. At noon, Lauren went out for a while, then returned. Nothing unusual. I let my shoulders relax, telling myself maybe I had gone too far. But I kept rewinding. The timestamp on the screen moved steadily until it reached a point around midday. Then I stopped. The image was still there, but nothing moved. The time in the corner continued ticking forward, minute by minute, but the scene remained frozen like a still photograph. I frowned and rewound that section again and again. 37 minutes. No more, no less. Exactly 37 minutes with no movement in the kitchen, the living room, or the hallway. Not because no one was there. I knew Margaret had been home at that time. Lauren, too. My heart started beating faster. I checked the system, thinking maybe the camera had malfunctioned. But no. Before and after that gap, everything worked perfectly. No technical interruptions, no alerts, just a clean, neat absence, as if someone had taken a knife and sliced out a piece of time. I rewound a few minutes further. The image suddenly began moving again, and at that exact moment, it felt like something clenched tightly around my chest. Margaret was lying on the kitchen floor. She wasn't lying flat. Her body was curled inward, one arm clutching the other, her head tilted to the side. Her hair was spread across the cold tile. I couldn't hear sound, but just looking was enough to know this wasn't the position of a harmless slip and fall. A few seconds later, Lauren appeared in the frame. She moved quickly, not with her usual calm pace. She bent down close to Margaret, then stood back up, looking around, lifting a hand to smooth her hair. That gesture, brushing her hair back, taking a deep breath, I knew it well. It was what Lauren always did when she was stressed, when she needed to steady herself. Then she grabbed her bag and walked straight out the back door. She didn't look back. The scene lasted only seconds, but I couldn't look away. I rewound it. Once, then again, and again. The 37-minute gap remained there, brazen and silent, like a challenge. I leaned back in the chair, a cold sensation spreading from my spine up to the base of my neck. I didn't need any more proof to understand that the missing footage hadn't vanished on its own. Someone had deleted it, and in this house, there was only one person with the knowledge, the composure, and the motive to do that. I turned off the monitor. The room fell into darkness. In that moment, I didn't feel anger right away. What hit me first was something heavier, far more painful: betrayal. Not betrayal in business, not betrayal between friends, but betrayal by blood. It didn't explode all at once. It spread slowly like oil seeping outward, soaking into every thought. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. Images of Lauren as a child came back vividly. Her first steps in this living room, falling and standing up again, laughing. The day I taught her how to drive, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, apologizing every time the car jerked. The nights she called me crying after her marriages fell apart, and I told her that no matter what happened, she would always have a home to return to. And now that home was the place where Margaret lay, curled on the floor, while my daughter fled in panic after erasing 37 minutes of truth. I stood there for a long time, not knowing how many minutes had passed. When I opened my eyes, I knew a line inside me had been crossed. From this moment on, I could no longer deceive myself. These were no longer scattered doubts or vague feelings. The truth had surfaced, even if only through an absence. I stepped out of the small room and closed the door quietly. The house was silent. Lauren was upstairs. Margaret was sleeping, or at least trying to. I stood in the hallway, looking toward my wife's bedroom, the weight pressing down on every step I took. I didn't go in to wake her. Not now. I knew that once I had seen what I had just seen, I could never go back to how things were. I needed time to think, to reorganize everything in my head. And more than anything, I needed to stay calm. If I let my emotions lead, I would ruin everything. That night, I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Beside me, Margaret's breathing was steadier, though now and then she whimpered softly in her sleep, as if something were chasing her. Each time, I tightened my grip on her hand, silently promising myself I would not let this disappear into silence. Those 37 minutes erased from the camera weren't just a gap in data. They were proof that something was terribly wrong under this roof. And from that moment on, I understood that I had no choice but to go all the way to the truth, even if the price would be far greater than anything I was ready to face. That night, I didn't sleep. I turned off the overhead light, leaving only the small bedside lamp on, the soft yellow glow Margaret liked because it didn't make her heart race. I sat against the headboard, back slightly hunched, hands resting on my thighs, listening to her breathing. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind slipping through the window frame, the wooden floor faintly creaking as the house contracted in the cold night. Margaret slept lightly. She shifted often, her brow furrowed, lips moving as if trying to say something that wouldn't come out. Each time, I placed my hand on her shoulder very gently, afraid that even a stronger touch might frighten her. I had never seen my wife so fragile. The woman who had stood firm beside me through decades of hardship now felt like a thin glass set at the edge of a table, waiting for one careless touch to shatter. Near dawn, as the sky outside the window began to turn a pale gray, Margaret suddenly sat up. She drew in a deep breath, like someone breaking the surface of water. I immediately leaned toward her. "I'm here," I whispered. "It's okay." Margaret turned to look at me, her eyes wide, pupils dilated with fear. In the dim light, I could see the dark circles beneath her eyes, the deeper lines etched into her face, as if time itself had managed to carve new marks overnight. She reached out and grabbed my hand, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breathing was rapid and uneven. I didn't rush her. I stayed still, letting her feel that I was here, that this room, this moment, was safe. Then she leaned closer, her voice trembling, barely more than breath slipping past her lips. Don't trust her." Those words landed heavier than any scream. I didn't ask her to repeat them. I was afraid that if I did, she would retreat again, retreat into the familiar silence. I just squeezed her hand gently, letting her know I was listening. Margaret swallowed, her throat working with effort. She glanced toward the bedroom door, as if afraid someone might be standing outside. I stood up, checked the door, quietly locked it, then returned to sit beside her. When I did, I saw her shoulders loosen just a little. I didn't want to sign," she said, each word seeming to be dragged from her chest. But she kept talking, over and over. My heart tightened. This was the first time Margaret had said it plainly. No more circling, no more avoidance. "Sign what?" I asked, my voice low and slow, trying to keep the panic rising inside me out of my words. Margaret shook her head, tears filling her eyes without spilling. "So many papers." She said it was about the bank, about the house. She said it was to protect you. She let out a quiet, twisted laugh, completely devoid of joy. She said if I didn't sign, everything would become complicated. She said you couldn't keep up anymore. I closed my eyes for a moment. I had heard Lauren say similar things before, in that calm, reasonable tone that was so hard to argue with. But hearing them now, from Margaret's mouth, in this moment, gave them an entirely different meaning. I was scared, Margaret continued in a whisper, gripping my hand tighter. I was afraid that if I told you, she'd make you believe I wasn't clear-headed anymore. She said people would side with her. Her voice broke and she couldn't go on. I saw her lips tremble, her teeth clicking softly together. That fear wasn't sudden. It had been cultivated, day by day, until Margaret no longer trusted her own voice. I leaned forward and gently rested my forehead against hers. "Listen to me," I said, my voice rough but steady. "I believe you. No matter what happens, I believe you." Margaret closed her eyes and a single tear finally fell, sliding down her cheek and soaking into the pillowcase. She released a long breath, as if shedding part of the weight she had been carrying for months. "I won't let anyone hurt you," I continued, slowly, deliberately. "No one, not even her." Margaret opened her eyes and looked at me, relief and fear tangled together. Don't say anything yet," she whispered. "I'm afraid she'll know." I nodded. In that instant, I understood that if I showed even the smallest sign that I knew the truth, Lauren would immediately change her tactics. I had seen it in her eyes, in the way she controlled the space around her. A direct confrontation now would only put Margaret in greater danger. "Okay," I said. "I won't say anything. We'll do this another way." Margaret searched my face, as if making sure I truly understood. "You rest," I added. "I'm here." She nodded faintly, her body gradually relaxed, her breathing slowing. Before long, she drifted back to sleep, this time deeper, though small tremors still passed through her from time to time. I sat beside the bed, afraid to move. Outside, the sky was brighter now. Dawn light slipped through the curtains, painting faint lines across the floor. A new day had begun, but inside me, something had changed forever. I watched Margaret sleep, the woman who had shared nearly 40 years of life with me, and I knew I could no longer hesitate. But I also knew that to protect her, I couldn't act out of anger or impulse. I had to pretend I knew nothing. That morning, when Lauren walked into the kitchen with her usual calm expression, I greeted her like any other day. I asked if she had slept well, if she wanted coffee. I even smiled, though every muscle in my body was tense. Lauren noticed nothing unusual. She talked about the day's schedule, about things that needed to be handled, as if everything were still under her control. I listened and memorized. I didn't object. I didn't question. Inside me, a quiet plan began to form, unhurried, unseen. I knew I needed time. I needed to observe more. I needed to collect every small fragment of truth, every detail Lauren believed she had hidden perfectly. More than anything, I needed to keep Margaret safe, both physically and emotionally. If I did this right, Lauren would never realize that from the moment Margaret whispered in the early dawn, the balance had begun to shift, slowly, silently, but irreversibly. The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same as before. In the morning, I made coffee and read the paper. Margaret sat by the window with sunlight on her shoulders. Lauren moved through the house with her familiar air of busyness. But inside me, every small detail was now lit differently. I no longer heard Lauren's words as harmless concern. I heard them as pieces of a picture slowly coming into focus. I began by quietly looking into the types of documents Lauren had mentioned so many times. I didn't ask directly. I didn't openly rummage through anything. I chose afternoons when Lauren went out, or moments when she was busy on the phone in her room. I went into my home office where I still kept old files, documents from my working years, neatly arranged in a metal cabinet. I opened each drawer, each folder, checking everything. The deed to the house, bank accounts, investments that had been closed long ago. I didn't see anything unusual there, but I knew that if Lauren had prepared in advance, the most important papers might no longer be kept here. That evening, when Lauren brought a stack of papers and placed them in front of Margaret in the living room, I paid closer attention than ever. She sat down, her voice gentle, patiently explaining each page. I heard familiar terms spoken aloud: power of attorney, representation, asset management, in case of emergency. "It's just paperwork, Mom," Lauren said. "So later, if anything happens, I can handle things quickly on your and Dad's behalf. It's for the future of the whole family." For the future. Lauren used that phrase so often it nearly became a mantra. Every time Margaret hesitated, every time I frowned, she repeated it, with the same soft but firm tone. I looked at Margaret. She sat there with her back slightly hunched, her hands clasped together on her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the papers, but I knew she wasn't really reading them. She was listening, trying to understand, but clearly not grasping everything being said. And what hurt me most was that Margaret didn't ask questions. Not because she didn't care, but because she was afraid. After dinner, when Lauren went upstairs, I quietly asked Margaret, "Do you understand all those papers?" Margaret, startled, glanced around, then turned to me. She shook her head slightly. "She said I didn't need to understand everything," she replied. "Just sign. She said it would be good for you." Those words caught in my throat. I realized that all this time, Lauren had been using me as the excuse. Every decision was wrapped in the phrase, "for Dad." And Margaret, who had always put family before herself, had been forced to choose between obeying her daughter or being seen as someone who stood in the way of her husband's future. That night, as we lay in bed, Margaret turned her back to me. I heard her sigh softly, a sound of exhaustion more than sadness. "She said if I told you," Margaret whispered, barely audible, "you'd think I was imagining things. She said people would believe her more." I closed my eyes as guilt surged through me. I had let this happen. I had unknowingly created the space for Lauren to step in, through my trust and carelessness. I had believed that because I loved my daughter, I would always understand her. And because I loved my wife, she would always be safe beside me. I was wrong. In the days that followed, I began keeping track, not by writing things down immediately, but in my mind. I remembered every time Lauren brought out paperwork, every moment she talked about banks, lawyers, risk prevention. I remembered the way Margaret's hand trembled after signing, how she quickly put the pen away as if afraid she had just done something irreversible. I also paid attention to how Lauren stored the documents. She didn't keep them in familiar places, not in the shared filing cabinet, not on a desk. I had seen her carefully place a stack of papers into her handbag, zip it up tightly, and carry it with her, even when she only went out to buy groceries. That kind of caution wasn't the behavior of someone helping. It was the vigilance of someone guarding something valuable, something they didn't want anyone else to touch. I started tracking down old copies, documents I still had. I called the bank, pretending to double-check a few details just to be sure. I didn't mention Lauren. I only asked about account status, access rights, recent changes. I memorized every answer carefully. At night, when Margaret was asleep, I sat alone in my office, opened my laptop, and researched the legal terms Lauren often mentioned. I wasn't a lawyer, but I understood enough to know that full power of attorney was no small matter. It wasn't just assistance, it was authority. And Margaret had been pushed to the edge of that decision, step by step, under the guise of protection. At times, I had to stop, stand up, and paced the room to steady myself. The question echoed in my head. How could I not have noticed sooner? How could I have let my wife believe I wouldn't stand by her? That self-reproach didn't weaken me, it sharpened me. I understood that if I let emotions take over, I would fail. Lauren didn't act on emotion, she acted on calculation. So I had to do the same. I began gathering materials systematically. I backed up every document still in my possession. I recorded dates, times, and circumstances whenever Lauren asked Margaret to sign something. I listened to every conversation, even passing ones, to understand where her plan was heading. More importantly, I maintained a normal appearance. I didn't object. I didn't openly question anything. I let Lauren believe everything was proceeding exactly as she intended, that I was just an aging husband, slow and compliant, gradually handing responsibility over to his daughter. But inside me, the foundation of a counterattack was already being laid. I knew there would come a time when I had to act. Not hastily, not impulsively, but at the right moment, when the evidence was clear, when Margaret was safe, when Lauren could no longer twist the story to suit herself. One night, as I sat alone in my office looking at the neatly stacked old folders in front of me, I suddenly understood that the word protection Lauren had attached to those papers was just a mask. Behind it was control, and if I didn't tear that mask away, not only our assets, but our entire lives would no longer belong to us. I closed the folder, turned off the light, and returned to the bedroom. Margaret lay there breathing evenly, her face more peaceful than it had been in days. I lay down beside her, placed my hand over hers, and in silence made a promise to myself. I would not let papers labeled protection become the thing that took away everything we had built over a lifetime. I didn't rush back to the camera room right after that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew I needed a clear head. Lauren still believed I knew nothing. Margaret was still trembling, but she was beginning to trust me. I couldn't afford to make a mistake at this stage. It wasn't until 2 days later, one afternoon when Lauren went out to meet a friend, that I returned to the small room at the end of the hallway. The door closed behind me with a drier sound than usual. I turned on the light, sat down in front of the screen, and took a deep breath. I didn't replay the main camera footage again. I had watched it too many times already. The 37 minutes that had vanished were still there, brazen like a deliberate wound. But this time, I did something I had previously overlooked. I opened the list of all devices that had ever been connected to the system, and then I saw it. An auxiliary camera. Old, low resolution, mounted in the back hallway, near the kitchen door leading to the yard. I froze. I had installed that camera a long time ago, when Margaret was still strong, when we worried about strangers circling the back of the house. Later, when I upgraded the system, I had almost completely forgotten about it. I remembered once intending to remove it, then leaving it because it couldn't hurt. That carelessness may have saved Margaret. I opened the feed from the auxiliary camera. The image was noticeably blurrier than the others, the colors washed out, the angle slightly off. But it was still working, and more importantly, nothing had been deleted. I dragged the timeline back to the exact 37-minute window missing from the main camera. My heart began pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I didn't fast forward. I let the video play slowly, second by second, as if moving too fast might cause me to miss something I could never recover. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Margaret stood in the kitchen, her back to the camera, washing a plate. She wore a gray, long-sleeved sweater, her silver hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck. The scene was painfully familiar. I had seen that image thousands of times in my life, never knowing that just minutes later it would become something that would change me forever. The back door opened. Lauren entered the frame. She didn't move quickly. She wasn't rushed. She walked very slowly, almost cautiously. The door closed behind her. I saw Lauren stand there for a few seconds as if steadying herself. Then she said something. The camera didn't capture sound, but I saw her lips move. Margaret turned around and shook her head. I leaned closer to the screen, unblinking. Margaret raised one hand, palm facing Lauren, a familiar gesture she used whenever she wanted to gently refuse something. I knew that gesture. I had lived with her for nearly 40 years. Lauren stepped forward. Margaret stepped back. Her back hit the edge of the table. And then it happened. Lauren reached out and grabbed Margaret's arm. Not the gentle grasp of a daughter helping her mother, but a tight, forceful grip. Margaret struggled. I saw her face change, her mouth open as if to scream. Lauren shoved her. Margaret lost her balance, slammed into the table, and fell to the floor. I shot up from my chair, both hands bracing against the desk as if I myself had been pushed. The screen shook slightly when I hit it. Margaret lay there, curled up. I saw her clutch her wrist, her face contorted in pain. Lauren stood over her, not bending down immediately. She paused, looked down, then glanced around, as if checking whether anyone had seen. Then Lauren bent down, not to help her mother up, but to pull her arm. I clearly saw the stack of papers in Lauren's hand. She placed them on the table and pushed a pen toward Margaret. Margaret shook her head, hard. I saw her lips move. She was pleading. I saw Lauren lean in close, speaking rapidly. Margaret raised her other hand to cover her face. Then Lauren tightened her grip on Margaret's wrist again. There was no doubt left, no possible explanation. It was violence, blatant, deliberate. Finally, Margaret trembled as she picked up the pen. Her hand shook so badly that the signature was crooked. I couldn't see exactly what she signed, but I knew it wasn't consent. It was submission. The moment Margaret released the pen, Lauren let go. She stood up straight, and then, as if an invisible switch had been flipped, Lauren raised her hands to her face. She began to cry. I had to clench my teeth to keep from making a sound. Lauren's shoulders shook. She sat down on the floor beside Margaret, head lowered, face covered by her hands. But I had seen enough. That wasn't the cry of panic. It was an act, a performance activated at the right moment, for the right audience. A few seconds later, Lauren stood up, smoothed her hair, took a deep breath. She picked up the papers and walked straight out of the frame. Margaret remained there, motionless, like a piece of discarded cloth on the floor. The video ended. I don't know how long I sat there. I only know I watched that footage no fewer than 10 times. Each time a new detail emerged, the grip of her hand, the pause before the shove, the cold look in Lauren's eyes when she thought no one was watching. With every replay, a part of me collapsed a little more. Not because I couldn't accept that my daughter was capable of doing that, but because I realized that deep down I had once doubted Margaret. I had thought, even briefly, that maybe she was being too sensitive, too anxious. And that thought, however fleeting, now stabbed into me like a knife. I turned off the video and slumped back into the chair, covering my face with my hands. I didn't cry out loud. What I felt then was no longer simple enough to be called pain or anger. It was the shattering of a belief that had lasted a lifetime. But I didn't allow myself to sink into it for long. I stood up and pulled an external hard drive from the drawer. I plugged it in and copied the entire video. Once, then again. I renamed the file, marked the exact date and time. I checked everything to make sure the video wasn't corrupted. Then, I made another copy on a second drive. I didn't keep them all in one place. One copy went into a locked drawer. Another I hid in the pocket of my jacket, the one I always carried with me. I did everything slowly, carefully, as if handling evidence in a case whose full gravity only I understood. When I shut down the computer, the room fell silent again. But this silence was no longer vague or uncertain. It was the silence of truth laid bare. I knew that from this moment on, everything had changed. There was no going back, no room left for self-deception. What I held in my hands wasn't just a video, it was proof. It was the line between protecting my family and allowing violence to remain hidden under the name of "for the future." I put the hard drives away, opened the camera room door, and stepped into the hallway. The house was still quiet. Margaret was sleeping in the bedroom. Lauren hadn't returned yet. I stood there under the dim lights and understood that the real confrontation still lay ahead. But at least now I was no longer walking in the dark. That morning, Lauren woke up very early. I knew because I heard her familiar footsteps moving around the kitchen before daylight fully broke. The smell of coffee drifted down the hallway, but it brought no comfort this time. It felt like a prepared ritual, cold and calculated. Lauren stepped into the bedroom and lightly knocked on the doorframe. "Is Mom awake yet?" she asked, her voice sickeningly sweet. "We need to go to the bank early today. They're holding the appointment for us." Margaret opened her eyes, and I clearly saw the flash of panic in her gaze before she managed to hide it. She turned toward me, gripping the bedsheet tightly. I placed my hand over hers and gave a gentle squeeze, a silent reminder that I was here. "I'll go with you," I said calmly. Lauren turned to me, freezing for a very brief moment. "That's not necessary, Dad," she replied quickly. "It's just paperwork. Mom and I will handle it fast. You stay home and rest." I looked straight into her eyes. "This is a family matter," I said, "and I'm part of this family." The air in the room seemed to harden. Lauren pressed her lips together, then forced a tight smile. "If you want," she said, but her tone had changed, firmer. "But I'm telling you now, everything is already prepared." We left the house as the sun was rising. Lauren drove, Margaret sat in the back seat, and I sat in the front. No one spoke. There was only the hum of the engine and the steady click of the turn signal. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Margaret with her head lowered, her hands clasped together, fingers white from gripping too tightly. The bank stood on a familiar street corner, a place we had visited countless times over the decades. Yet today the building felt strangely unfamiliar. The glass walls reflected the sunlight, glaringly bright. Lauren walked in quickly, as if afraid we might slow down. She spoke to the receptionist, stating her name with ease like someone who had been here many times. "We have an appointment," she said, "regarding power of attorney documents." The bank employee looked at us and gave a professional smile. "Yes, please follow me into this room." We were led into a small, private room with a light wooden table and 3 chairs. A thick folder was already laid out on the table. I glanced at it and saw the familiar terms I had researched through sleepless nights: full power of attorney, right of representation, authority to decide. Margaret sat down, her hands visibly trembling. I pulled my chair closer to hers and placed my hand over hers openly, without hiding it. Lauren sat across from us, back straight, eyes sharp. The bank employee began explaining in an even, neutral tone. "According to this file, Mrs. Margaret will grant full authority to Ms. Lauren to manage all assets in the event—" "Stop," I said. The room fell silent. The bank employee looked up at me, slightly confused. Lauren snapped her head toward me, a flash of anger crossing her face. "What are you doing, Dad?" she said, no longer able to keep her calm tone. "We've already talked about this." "I haven't agreed to anything," I replied, "and I can see that my wife is not in a condition to sign any documents." Lauren let out a dry laugh. "Mom is always like that," she said. "You know that. She worries too much, imagines things. If I don't take care of it, it'll be a big mess later." Margaret slightly pulled her hand back, as if she wanted to disappear. I felt how cold her hand was. I turned to her and lowered my voice. You don't have to do anything if you don't want to." Lauren slammed her hand down on the table. The sharp sound echoed in the small room. "Enough!" she snapped. "Everyone's acting like I'm some kind of villain. I'm just protecting this family." "By what means?" I asked. "By forcing someone to sign papers out of fear?" The bank employee cleared her throat. "Sir, ma'am, if there's any kind of family dispute, perhaps we should—" "No," I cut in. "This is exactly where it needs to be made clear." Lauren turned to Margaret. "Say something, Mom," she urged, her voice tense. "You agreed. You already signed." Margaret lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. I could feel her entire body stiffen. Then, very slowly, she lifted her face. Her eyes were red, but this time she didn't look away. I didn't agree," she said, her voice weak but clear. "I was afraid." The room seemed to stop breathing. Lauren froze, eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "You're embarrassing me." "I was afraid," Margaret repeated, her voice shaking but stronger. "You forced me. You hurt me. I didn't understand those papers." The bank employee stood up abruptly. "Ma'am, if there was any coercion—" Lauren turned on me, her face flushed. "Say something, Dad," she shouted. "Whose side are you on?" I didn't answer right away. I opened my jacket pocket slowly, letting everyone in the room see what I was doing. I took out a small black recording drive and placed it on the table. The soft sound of metal touching wood was quiet, but to me it was louder than any shouting. "This is the truth," I said, "and it's been recorded." Lauren stared at the device as if she didn't believe her eyes. "What is that?" she asked, her confidence already gone. "It's what shows what happened in my kitchen," I replied, "during the time when the main camera footage was deleted." Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, but this time she didn't curl in on herself. She sat up straight as if an invisible weight had just been lifted from her. The bank employee stepped back, her expression serious. "I think," she said slowly, "we need to report this according to procedure." Lauren jumped to her feet, her chair tipping backward. "No one gets to see that!" she screamed. "Dad, you don't have the right—" "I do," I said, my voice low but firm, "because it's my house, my wife, and the truth." In that moment I saw the collapse in my daughter's eyes, not sadness but fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of losing control. Margaret reached out and took my hand. For the first time in a long while, her grip wasn't trembling. It was firm, a quiet confirmation that she had spoken, and she wouldn't take it back. I knew that from the moment the recording drive was placed on that table, everything had entered a new phase. It was no longer suspicion contained within the walls of our home, no longer whispered fear at dawn. The truth had stepped into the light, in front of people who weren't part of our family. And Lauren, for the first time, could no longer control the narrative. As we left the bank that day, I knew Lauren wouldn't stop. The look in her eyes when she saw the recording drive on the table wasn't remorse. It was the look of someone who had just lost the upper hand and was already calculating the next move. I had lived long enough to recognize that. People who are used to controlling everything don't accept defeat quietly. Sure enough, that very evening my phone began to vibrate. The first message from Lauren was short and cold. "You're making everything worse. Stop before it's too late." I didn't reply. 10 minutes later, another message came through. "If you keep going, I'll tell everyone you're manipulating, Mom." No one believes a panicked old woman. I read it, set the phone down on the table, and felt a chill run down my spine. Margaret sat across from me and saw the change in my face. "What did she say?" she asked softly. I didn't show her the phone, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want to frighten her more. I simply took her hand and said slowly, "It's okay. We're not facing this alone anymore." That night, after Margaret had fallen asleep, I sat alone in my office with the desk lamp on. I took out the recording drive and placed it in front of me like a reminder. This evidence was powerful, but I knew that to end everything, I needed more than that. Lauren didn't rely only on violence. She used words, manipulation, the image of a devoted daughter to hide her ambition. I needed someone who understood the law, who understood how things like this actually ended. I called Ethan Moore the next morning. Ethan was a lawyer I had met many years ago when an old friend of mine was caught up in a family dispute. When I introduced myself, he was silent for a few seconds before saying, "I remember you. Your voice hasn't changed much." I didn't waste time. I told him everything, from the documents labeled protection to the video in the kitchen. On the other end of the line, Ethan listened carefully, occasionally asking for a detail. When I finished, he sighed. "You're dealing with someone who knows exactly what she's doing," he said, "and she won't stop on her own. If you want to end this, we need to let her expose herself completely." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Make her talk," Ethan replied. "Not in a burst of anger, but when she thinks she's winning. People like that only show their true face when they believe they have nothing left to hide." I sat quietly, thinking. "You want me to negotiate with my daughter?" "Pretend to negotiate," Ethan corrected. "You don't need to actually give in. You just need her to think you're exhausted, that you're willing to compromise for peace. And most importantly, everything has to be recorded." I looked toward the bedroom where Margaret was sleeping. The thought of facing Lauren again made my chest feel heavy. But I knew that if I didn't do this, she would keep coming back, keep threatening, keep trying to control our lives. "All right," I said, I'll do it." Ethan gave me detailed instructions. I prepared a small audio recorder, tested it several times to make sure it worked. I rehearsed what I would say in my head, not too firm, not too weak. A tired father who wanted to keep the family together, willing to give a little to regain peace. That was the role I had to play. I called Lauren the next afternoon. "We need to talk," I said, deliberately slow and heavy. "I don't want this to go any further." Lauren was silent for a few seconds. I could almost hear the calculations in her mind. "So you finally understand," she said. "I can come by tonight." When Lauren arrived, I was ready. Margaret was in her room, resting exactly as planned. I wanted this conversation to be just the two of us. Lauren walked into the living room, glanced around out of habit, her eyes sweeping every corner. I could see the caution in her stance and the confidence returning. "What do you want to say, Dad?" Lauren asked, sitting down across from me. I sighed, playing my part. "I'm tired," I said. "I don't want court. I don't want the neighbors talking. Your mother is weak. I just want peace." Lauren smirked. "I said it from the beginning. If you'd listened to me, things would have been different." "Maybe," I replied. "But you have to understand, what you did went too far." "Too far?" Lauren laughed. "If I hadn't pushed her, would she have signed? Do you really think she's still capable of making decisions?" I stayed silent for a beat, letting her continue. Lauren leaned back in her chair, her voice lowering. "You don't get it. If I don't take control, everything you and Mom have will fall apart. I'm just doing what has to be done." "By pushing your mother to the floor?" I asked calmly. Lauren crossed her arms. "You saw it," she said bluntly. "She resisted. I couldn't let everything fall apart because of that weakness." My heart tightened, but I didn't show it. "And those papers?" I asked. "What do you plan to do with them?" Lauren tilted her head, looking at me as if I were slow. "I need full authority," she said. "The house, the accounts, everything. I can't protect you if I don't have control." "Protect," I repeated. "Call it whatever you want. Lauren replied coldly. "I've sacrificed enough. Now it's my turn to benefit." Those words settled heavily in the room. I let her talk. Sentence by sentence, word by word. The recorder in my jacket pocket captured everything. I asked a few more questions, pretending to hesitate, pretending to want clarity. And Lauren, confident in herself, said it all. When she stood up to leave, I knew I had enough. I didn't stop her. I only said, "I'll think about it." Lauren smiled, the smile of someone who believed she had just won. "You should," she said. "Don't make things worse." The door closed behind her. I sat there for a long time, until I was sure she was gone. Then I took out the recorder and placed it on the table beside the recording drive. 2 pieces of evidence lay there silently, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of mistakes. I knew that from this moment on, Lauren had nothing left to deny. Her final scheme had exposed itself, and the trap that Ethan and I had set had closed, not with anger, but with her own confession. That evening, I barely heard the car pull up in front of the house. It wasn't until the doorbell rang, a short, decisive ring with no hesitation, that I stood up. My heart pounded, but not from surprise. I had known this moment would come. I just didn't know it would come so soon. I opened the door. 2 police officers stood on the porch, dark jackets on, streetlight casting sharp lines across their faces. The man in front spoke in a low, professional voice. "We need to speak with you regarding a case involving domestic violence and financial fraud." I nodded and stepped aside to let them in. The house was so quiet I could hear their shoes against the hardwood floor. Margaret came out of the bedroom, one hand on the doorframe. When she saw the officers, she froze, her face going pale. I hurried over to support her. "It's okay," I whispered. "It's almost over." Lauren appeared at the top of the stairs. She was still wearing the jacket she'd had on when she left earlier, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes darting quickly between me and the officers. For a split second, I saw pure panic flash across her face before it was covered by a forced smile. "What's going on?" Lauren asked, struggling to sound calm. "Is there some kind of mistake?" One of the officers stepped forward. "Lauren," he said, reading her name correctly, "we need you to cooperate. There are serious allegations regarding your actions." Lauren stepped back half a pace. I saw her hand tighten around the strap of her bag. Her eyes flicked toward the back door, then toward the stairs. That was no longer the look of a devoted daughter, nor of someone trying to explain. It was the look of someone searching for an escape. "Dad," Lauren turned to me, her voice breaking. "What did you do? Did you call them?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, the child I once held in my arms, taught to ride a bike, sheltered from rain and sun, and realized there was no answer left that could save this anymore. "I told the truth," I replied quietly, "and I handed over the evidence." Margaret let out a soft moan, her body trembling. I felt her weight lean heavily into my arm. She was barely able to stay on her feet anymore. The other officer hurried over and pulled out a chair for her to sit down. Lauren laughed, a hoarse, uncontrolled sound. "Evidence?" she repeated. "Just some stupid recordings and words. No one's going to believe that." "I believe it," the officer said shortly, "and the court will review the rest." Lauren turned and moved quickly toward the back door. Everything happened fast. "Lauren, stop!" one of the officers shouted, but she had already lunged forward, twisting the doorknob hard. The door hadn't even opened before they caught her. Lauren screamed and struggled, trying to break free. "Let me go! You don't have the right!" Her voice was high-pitched and panicked, completely different from the cold confidence she'd carried in recent days. I stood there, frozen. Everything unfolded like a slow-motion film. Lauren was restrained, handcuffed. The sound of metal snapping shut echoed sharply, like a final period at the end of a sentence. "Lauren," I called out, not knowing why, whether to stop it or to say something final. She turned to look at me. There was no calculation left in her eyes now, only pure fear. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm your daughter." Those words pierced me like a dull knife. But I didn't step forward. I didn't pull her into my arms. I just stood there, holding Margaret. "Because you are my daughter," I said heavily, word by word. "I can't keep hiding what you've done." The officers read out the charges: domestic violence, coercion to sign documents, financial fraud. Each word echoed through the familiar rooms of our home, sounding distant and cold. Lauren didn't scream anymore. She stood still, eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe those words now belonged to her. As they led Lauren outside, Margaret suddenly collapsed. I caught her just in time before she slid off the chair. Her whole body shook violently, her breathing broken and uneven. I knelt in front of her, gripping her thin shoulders. "It's over," I said, even though my throat tightened. "She can't hurt you anymore." Margaret cried, but without sound. Tears streamed down her hollowed face. This wasn't the cry of relief. It was the cry of a mother watching her child being taken away in handcuffs. I stood up and went into my study. I took out the recording drive, the audio recorder, the copies of documents I had prepared. I handed everything over to the police, one item at a time. They logged it, sealed it, worked professionally. No one offered words of comfort, and I didn't need any. When the door closed behind them, the house fell silent. A silence unlike before. No more lurking tension, no more threats, but no peace either. I sat down beside Margaret. We didn't speak. I looked around the living room, the place where Lauren had once sat, spoken, commanded. Everything was still there, the chair, the table, the rug. But the family I thought I had was no longer whole. I didn't feel victory. There was no sense of justice served the way people often describe it. There was only a vast emptiness opening in my chest, an emptiness shaped like a child. Margaret rested her head on my shoulder, exhausted, beyond tears. I held her, my back bent by the years. We sat like that for a long time, in a house that had once been the safest place in the world, now holding only the fragments of trust. My family had fallen apart, not with a loud explosion, but through quiet, painful decisions that could never be taken back. And in that moment, I understood that the price of truth is sometimes not justice, but the permanent loss of what you once loved most. The trial took place on a gray morning, the sky low and heavy, as if it carried the weight of everything about to be exposed. Margaret and I arrived early. She wore her old beige sweater, her hand gripping mine tightly, her knuckles standing out from tension. I felt the slight tremor pass into me, not from the cold, but from fear, deeper than anything she had endured in all the years we'd shared together. The courtroom wasn't large, but every wall felt cold and distant. The rows of wooden benches, the smell of old paper, the metallic scent from the railings, all of it blended into an atmosphere so severe it was suffocating. I looked around and saw unfamiliar faces, lawyers, court staff, a few members of the public. No friends, no relatives. In that moment, our family was just the two of us. Lauren was brought in afterward. She wore simple clothes, her hair neatly tied back, her face so pale it seemed drained of color. When her eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of hesitation, quickly replaced by a forced hardness. She sat at the defendant's table, back straight, hands folded together as if rehearsed. The trial began. The judge read through the charges in an even, emotionless voice. The legal terms landed one by one, like hammer blows on solid wood. Domestic violence, coercion to sign documents, financial fraud. I heard them all, but in my mind there was only one image. Margaret curled up on the kitchen floor, clutching her wrist, terror in her eyes. When it came time to present evidence, our lawyer stood. He didn't say much. He simply asked the court's permission to play the video. The room darkened. The screen lit up. I felt Margaret tighten her grip on my hand as the familiar image appeared. The kitchen in our home, the slightly tilted angle, the washed-out colors. I didn't watch the screen for long. I watched Margaret's face. She closed her eyes when Lauren entered the frame. When the push happened, I saw her lips press together, her breathing quicken. But she didn't turn away. She didn't ask for it to stop. She let the truth run its course. There were soft murmurs in the courtroom. No one spoke out loud, but I felt the shift in the air. The video ended. The lights came back on. Lauren lowered her head, shoulders curling inward, her hands trembling despite her effort to control them. Then Margaret was called to testify. She stood very slowly. I wanted to rise and help her, but she shook her head. She took one step at a time, her back slightly bent, but her gaze steady. When she placed her hand on the witness stand, I realized something had changed. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. Margaret told everything in a quiet but clear voice. She spoke of the times Lauren brought papers to her, of the words that confused her, of the fear that no one would believe her if she spoke up. When she reached the day in the kitchen, her voice trembled, but it didn't break. She spoke of the push, the pain in her wrist, of being forced to hold the pen while her mind went blank. No one interrupted her, not even Lauren's lawyer. The room was so silent I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. When Margaret returned to her seat, I saw her exhale deeply, as if setting down a burden she had carried for far too long. I took her hand. This time it was warmer. Lauren was then asked to speak in her defense. She stood, adjusted her jacket, took a deep breath. She talked about pressure, responsibility, about just wanting to take care of her parents. She said everything had been misunderstood, that the video didn't show the whole story. But every word sounded hollow, like a speech delivered to an empty room. When the lawyer asked, "Do you deny using force against your mother?" Lauren stayed silent. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it said everything. The verdict came near the end of the morning. The judge declared that all authorization documents signed under coercion were completely void. All rights to manage assets were returned to us. Then came the sentencing. Prison time was imposed. Not the number I had imagined during sleepless nights, but enough to make it clear that what Lauren had done could not be ignored. Lauren broke down crying. Not the fake crying I had seen in the video, but choking, shattered sobs. She turned to look at us, her eyes pleading. I didn't turn away, but I didn't step forward either. Some distances, once opened, can't be closed with just a few steps. When the trial ended, everyone stood. Margaret remained seated for a while, as if she needed time to understand that it was truly over. I helped her up. We walked out of the courtroom in silence. Outside, the clouds had begun to thin. Pale light fell across the courthouse steps. I took a deep breath. The truth had won. The law had spoken. But there was no joy in my heart. Only a quiet, lingering pain, like a wound that no longer bleeds but never fully heals. We had kept our lives. We had kept our dignity. But the price was the child we once believed would stay by our side until the end. I wrapped my arm around Margaret's shoulders. She leaned into me, tired but calmer than before. We walked slowly away from the place that had just closed the most painful chapter of our lives. The truth, when finally spoken, doesn't bring happiness. It brings an ending. And sometimes that is all a person can bear. After everything that happened, life didn't return to the way it was. I had once thought that once the trial was over, once the truth was out, everything would settle on its own. But life doesn't work like legal documents. It moves more slowly, more quietly, and often with more pain. In the first days after the trial, our house was strangely quiet. No more hurried footsteps of Lauren moving through the kitchen. No more whispered phone calls behind half-closed doors. No more stacks of papers placed on the table with that familiar, pressuring voice. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock, reminding me that time was still passing, even though everything inside us had changed forever. Margaret needed time. I knew that from the beginning. Her body was still here, but her spirit was like someone just emerging from a storm that had lasted months. In those first nights, she didn't sleep deeply. I often woke in the middle of the night feeling her hand tremble in mine. Sometimes she startled awake, breathing fast, as if still trapped in that kitchen. I didn't push her to be okay. I didn't say empty phrases like, "It's all over now." Instead, I was just there, making tea, sitting by the window with her in the mornings, walking slowly around the neighborhood when the sun was gentle. Small things we had once taken for granted now became fragile threads holding us to the present. Gradually, Margaret began to heal in her own way, not with a sudden leap forward, but with very small changes. She started watering the plants on the porch again. She began turning on the radio in the mornings, listening to old songs she used to love. One day, I heard her quietly humming along to a familiar tune. I stood still in the kitchen, not stepping out, afraid to break that delicate moment. The house slowly found its own rhythm again. It was still the same house, with scratches in the wooden floor and family photos on the walls, but the heaviness had eased. The constant tension in the air was gone. The fear no longer crept in after every sentence. Still, there was an emptiness nothing could fill. Lauren. Her room stayed closed for weeks. I didn't dare open it, neither did Margaret. It held too many memories, beautiful ones, and others now stained with pain. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the hallway, Margaret stood in front of that door for a long time. She placed her hand on the doorknob, then let it fall. "Not yet," she whispered. I nodded. Some doors aren't impossible to open, but opening them too soon makes the wound bleed again. I learned to live with the truth one day at a time. Some mornings I woke up and for a brief moment forgot everything. Then the memories returned, clear and unyielding. I had lost a child, not to an accident, not to distance, but to her own choices. That didn't make me stop loving Lauren, but it forced me to accept a hard truth. Love does not mean blindness. Being a parent doesn't mean covering up every action, even when doing so breaks your heart. Some evenings, Margaret and I sat together in silence, just listening to the wind in the yard, the rustle of leaves. In that quiet, I felt clearly what remained after everything. We had lost the illusion of a perfect family. We had lost the sense of safety that blood alone could be a refuge. But we still had each other. And at this age, that was no small thing. We still had the truth. We still had dignity. We still had the ability to look directly at what had happened without turning away. I looked at Margaret, the woman who had walked beside me for nearly a lifetime, and understood that choosing the truth was what had kept us from losing ourselves. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if there will ever be a day when I can think of Lauren without pain. Maybe that pain will never fully fade, but I do know this. From now on, our lives will no longer be built on fear or silence. Every morning when I make coffee and Margaret sits across from me, her eyes calmer than before, I know we are learning how to live again. Slowly, carefully, but honestly. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. Some truths cost us dearly, but if we don't face them, we lose ourselves. I share this story not to seek pity and not to judge anyone. I only want to say that sometimes the greatest tragedies don't come from strangers, but from the people we love most. And in those moments, the right choice is never the easy one. If you've stayed with me through these lines, I want to say thank you. A sincere thank you. Thank you for listening, for not turning away from a story as difficult as this one. If you'd like, share in the comments where you're watching from and what you think you would do if you were in my place. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next stories, because sometimes just knowing you're not alone is already a great comfort. Thank you for staying.